In addition to the war refocusing our manufacturing and jobs and role of women in society, it really also reshaped Americans' understandings of themselves as people, right? This struggle against Nazi tyranny and superiority was kind of helped Americans to focus on the idea that really Americans could enjoy freedoms equally. Immigrants that were seen as other were really fully accepted as loyal Americans. But, what some Americans struggled with was that they didn't really feel like that applied to them, right? Could all Americans actually enjoy freedoms equally? It is certainly true for many European immigrants, not necessarily Jews or other groups that kind of felt more ethnic or non-white to Americans. And certainly the idea of enjoying freedoms was far more ambiguous for non-white groups, right? There's so many racial barriers that existed in this time. But the war set in motion a lot of changes that reverberated in the post-war years, especially things like the civil rights movement and all of the other movements that kind of come up in the 1950s and 1960s, which we'll get to in the coming weeks. One program that the federal government instituted that really had an impact on rights campaigns that would happen in the 1950s and 1960s was the Bracero program. The Bracero program was a program that both the Mexican and American governments worked together with. They contracted thousands of workers to come to the United States from Mexico to work in industry and work in agriculture. The Bracero program starts during the war, and it lasts until 1964. Certainly, there's lots of new opportunities for the second generation who worked in industry and served. Many served in the war themselves. It also creates this new Chicano culture, which is going to be really important moving forward because there's an identity issue here. And you have the beginnings of pushback on treatment of Chicanos. And you see that in the midst of the war through the Zoot Suit riots. The Zoot Suit was the popular form of dress for Chicano men. And you can see these are Zoot Suits right here. This is commonly what they wore. And so they were called Zoot Suit riots. And that's what it was named because a lot of Chicano men kind of stood up to protest discrimination that they were facing in California and other parts of the Southwest. And so they kind of stood up, and that's really the beginning of Chicano push for equal rights. Moving to Native Americans, over 25,000 Native Americans served in the Army. One of the most important code makers were Native Americans, the Navajo Code Talkers. They specifically created a military code based on the Navajo language that was never broken throughout the entire midst of the war. And many Native Americans left their reservations during the war for industry jobs that were located in urban areas. And when those jobs kind of pulled away, or when there weren't as many jobs, or when the war is over, many chose not to return to the reservation. And so you're going to see in the 1960s an urban Native American rights movement that is really focused on the needs of Native Americans, not on a reservation, but in urban spaces. Those who served in the war were able to take advantage of something that was known as the GI Bill that provided lots of benefits to veterans who had served in the war. That's again something that I'm going to talk to you about in the coming weeks. Many Chinese were finally accepted in the United States. The immigration ban on Chinese Americans was lifted in the midst of the war, but not all Asian Americans faced the same accepting from Americans. The Japanese experience was far different from that of Chinese Americans. When it came to us fighting Germany, it was all about an ideological struggle. But when it came to us fighting Japan, it really became a race war. The government viewed anyone of Japanese descent as being very suspicious. They were depicted in film and political cartoons and wartime posters as bestial, subhuman. Many people, and the government especially, really exaggerated fears of a Japanese invasion. There were many people in the government that were worried about the Japanese invading the United States, and then the Japanese Americans that were living here at the time rising up with the Japanese military and fighting against Americans. And those fears led to President Roosevelt passing Executive Order 9066, where 110,000 Japanese Americans were forced into internment camps. And basically they were forced from their homes and they were forced to go to these camps to live. Many of the camps that they were sent to were like former horse stables. They would be behind barbed wire fences. They would be patrolled by armed guards. And courts really upheld the government's right to intern Japanese Americans. It was protested. The Communist Party and the NAACP vehemently opposed Japanese American internment. There's actually a court case that goes all the way to the Supreme Court, which is Korematsu v. U.S., where the Supreme Court denied the appeal of Korematsu, who was arrested for refusing to go to the camps. So this man stood up and said, "I refuse, I'm not going to go." And the Supreme Court denied an appeal and basically said that the government was well within its rights to force this man into an internment camp. In 1988, the federal government issued a formal apology to Native Americans and issued $20,000 to each survivor who had gone to an internment camp. It wasn't just that these men and women were uprooted from their homes and forced into these camps. Most of the time, when they would leave their homes, when these Japanese Americans would leave their homes, they would then lose that property. They would lose their businesses, any items that they couldn't fit with them, and they really could only carry, a suitcase with them, and they had to pack very quickly. Anything that they left behind was no longer theirs. So it wasn't just that they were uprooted from their homes and forced to live in these camps that really look very much like concentration camps that you would have found in Germany. They also lost everything about their lives. All they had were their families and the things that they could fit within a suitcase. For African Americans, there's even more movement to northern urban centers. So many more move to northern urban centers that it basically dwarfs the Great Migration that happens in the midst of World War I. The amount of people that were moving into the north, they actually called it Liberty Trains. So many people were moving into the north. 1 million African Americans served in the military. Now, they did serve in segregated units, so you did not have integrated military at this time. African Americans would be in their own units. And usually African Americans were given non-combat jobs. And many draftees who had enlisted in the North were sent to the South for training. And the GI Bill that I mentioned that gave a lot of benefits to veterans, African American soldiers were often not able to benefit from that GI Bill. But World War II is the birth of the modern civil rights movement that really comes into its own in the 1950s and 1960s. And that civil rights movement is spurred by the exclusion of African Americans from wartime industry. Much of the movement that starts is focused on labor. This man, A. Philip Randolph, who is pictured right here, was a labor leader, and he called for a March on Washington. We've all heard about the March on Washington from Martin Luther King that happens in the 1950s and 1960s. But this March on Washington was going to happen in the midst of World War II, and it was organized by A. Philip Randolph. And he called for this March on Washington for jobs and freedom, to get defense employments for African Americans, end segregation, push an anti-lynching law. And this march doesn't happen. And the reason why it doesn't happen is because A. Philip Randolph was persuaded to call it off by FDR, because FDR issued Executive Order 8802 that banned discrimination in defense jobs and established a Fair Employment Practices Commission to monitor employment or compliance. Now, the Fair Employment Practices Commission lacked enforcement power, but the executive order and the movement that FDR was making for African Americans led A. Philip Randolph to cancel the March on Washington. Now, during the war, NAACP membership grew. Another group, CORE, the Congress on Racial Equality, was founded in 1942, and they really established sit-ins. And you see the beginning of something that was known as the Double V campaign. Now, not to seem like they were unpatriotic or unsupportive of the United States, the Double V was both a victory over Germany and Japan, but it had to be accompanied by victory over segregation at home. What African Americans were trying to bring attention to in the Double V campaign was that there was a massive gap between wartime ideals and reality. And it also helps that in the 1940s, there is a book that is published by a German man who had come to the United States. His name was Gunnar Myrdal. And he wrote this book called An American Dilemma. And this book had a lot of influence on leaders at the time, specifically in the civil rights movement, but also FDR himself. And this book reflected new concerns, not new concerns, but new concerns to some people, like how entrenched racism was in the laws, the politics, the economics, the social behavior of everyday Americans, and that the government really needed to take the lead in outlawing discrimination. It wasn't going to happen unless the government actually took a stand and did something about it. Now, we've looked at what the war looked like at home, and in the first screencast, I talked about like what the beginning of the war looks like and what the turning point is. But now we're going to talk about how does the war actually end. May 8th of 1945 is known as VE Day, or Victory in Europe Day, which was a formal end to the war in Germany. Also, in 1944, FDR won a fourth term to the presidency, unprecedented again, but he actually died. He takes office in January of 1944, but he dies on April 12th of 1945. Harry Truman actually served as vice president, so when FDR passes away, Harry Truman becomes president. And when he becomes president, he is brought up to speed on a scientific project that had been undertaken in the midst of the war. I had mentioned in the previous screencast about the government funneling a lot of money into scientific research for things like radar and the first computers. But one project that was of scientific research that had probably the most impact at the time was the atomic bomb. That was developed in the Manhattan Project because military intelligence that we were receiving was saying that Nazis were developing the same weapon. We tested this weapon in July of 1945, and on August 6th, Truman made the decision to drop an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. When that bomb was dropped, 70,000 people died instantly. And over a period of time, with the effects of radiation and injuries that were sustained when the bomb was dropped, another 140,000 died by the end of 1945. Then the Japanese military did not surrender after the Hiroshima bomb. So on August 9th, the United States dropped a second atomic bomb on Nagasaki. The next week, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and invaded Manchuria. And then within the week, Japan decided to surrender. The use of this bomb remains quite a controversial decision. Truman, when he made the decision, he had been receiving information that the Japanese military was in a much stronger position than what it turns out that they actually were. He was, quoted a lot of numbers of U.S. casualties of what it would happen if the United States decided to invade Japan. And so he made the decision to drop the bomb to prevent more American casualties. We also in history have the benefit of hindsight, and so we know now that the Japanese military was in much worse shape than what we had initially thought they were. And so it does seem that the use of the atomic bomb was unnecessary based on the information that we have now. And when I talk about Truman is trying to spare lives, what we're looking at, in the midst of this entire war, the numbers of men killed is much larger than in World War I. Over 50 million men and women died in World War II. 20 million of that were civilians. So you have 30 million military personnel that are killed in the midst of the war, but then 20 million civilians. And that's not counting Nazis that were killed. That is not including the German numbers. So we know that that number is much larger. By the end of the war, there were a series of meetings that had been happening between Allied leaders. There was a meeting in Tehran, in Yalta. The final one was in Potsdam. The early meetings, Tehran and Yalta, were between Stalin, FDR, and Winston Churchill. We see those men in this picture here. These pictures above, this is, I believe, Hiroshima. So this is what the city of Hiroshima looked like before. If you just notice this church right here, this is kind of the important structure that you want to be taking a look at in this image. This is what Hiroshima looks like after the bomb. And this church in this image is the church that you're seeing here. But the big three, as they were known, this is Winston Churchill, who was Prime Minister of Great Britain, FDR, President of the United States, and then Stalin, who is the leader of the Soviet Union. So the big three meet in Tehran and Yalta. They're establishing a lot of different things that deal with how they're going to concentrate their military operations together. The final meeting happens in Potsdam, and Stalin is the only one of the big three that remains. FDR has passed away at that point, so he is replaced by Harry Truman, and Churchill is no longer Prime Minister of Great Britain, and so he is replaced by Clement Attlee. During that meeting at Potsdam, the things that were discussed were the military administration for Germany and what was going to happen to Nazi leaders after the war. These discussions about how Germany was going to be handled in the post-war years brought out a lot of tension between these three leaders, tensions that were going to remain, tensions that were the beginning of the Cold War, which is something that is really I'm going to be focusing on in every single lecture from now pretty much until the end of the semester. Also at these meetings, the leaders agree to a United Nations with a Security Council, an 11-member Security Council that would have 5 permanent members: the United States, the United Kingdom, China, France, and the Soviet Union. what this war's end, certainly at the end of this war, there was peace. But just like in World War I, where there's problems that are created in the aftermath of the war, World War II, just because we don't see a World War III immediately after, it doesn't mean that there is complete peace. In the years that are following, and what you're going to see in the next few weeks of lecture, is that there is peace, but there is no harmony between these countries. And that's something that exists well into the 1980s. And really, we still see repercussions of those tensions and lack of harmony today.